Folks, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers are currently $55 million over the cap. They need to get cap compliant by the start of the new league year on March 15th. And because of this, there are a lot of tough decisions that may need to be made regarding their roster. One of those decisions we may be talking about, or we will be talking about being a possibility in this video today, is Russell Gage and the possibility of whether or not the Buccaneers may keep him or release him. I am not alone in this video today. Talking to me is my colleague over at MrBucsNation.com, the co-host of the Cannon Fire podcast and the main host of the Real to Real podcast, Mr. Evan Wanish. Evan, how you doing today?
I'm doing pretty good. How are you?
I'm doing pretty good, and one of the reasons I wanted to make this video was because of an article that was written from our colleague Scott Reynolds over at pewterreport.com. He always does a mailbag video on Mondays, and one of the questions that he was asked in said mailbag video was any chance of Russell Gage, or any chance Russell Gage restructures and fits Dave Canales' system. And the answer from Scott Reynolds to this question, I guess I should say, was pretty interesting to me, Evan. And I want to talk about it and kind of see how it applies to the possibility of keeping Russell Gage. And it starts off with this. The Bucs were frustrated with Russell Gage's first season in Tampa Bay. It then goes on to talk about the contract that Gage signed this past offseason and didn't necessarily get the best return for Gage. He had 51 catches, 426 yards, and overall did not do what a guy who makes $10 million a year does. Evan, is that a fair thing to say that Russell Gage did not meet expectations this previous season?
Yeah, I think so. I wouldn't necessarily say he was necessarily bad, but just like you said, when you're paying a guy $10 million, you're expecting a little bit more. I mean, that's a premium price for a third wide receiver, and just expect him to step up a little bit more, especially with defense has given so much attention to Mike Evans and Chris Godwin. We're really hoping that, Russell Gage would have been able to get a lot of mismatches and be able to take advantage of those, and he just wasn't.
Yeah, and then Scott goes into it a little bit deeper like this, where it does say yes, Russell Gage was hamstringed by an injury this year, or hamstringed by a hamstring injury this year that did rob him of his separation skills, of his quickness. But one thing that Reynolds says here in this article is that Gage frustrated the team with his rehab process, and Reynolds thinks that the Bucs are eyeing $2.8 million worth of salary cap space the team can create with his release. And Reynolds even takes it a step farther by saying that he does not think a restructuring is in Tampa Bay's interest and that Gage would possibly have to agree to a substantial pay cut instead, as Reynolds thinks he's not worth $10 million a year. Evan, what are your thoughts on that, on the possibility that the team is frustrated with Gage over his injury woes last year and how he handled that rehab process, and how a restructuring might not even be in the cards right now, as it seems?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I can't really speak on the whole rehab thing, but as far as being frustrated with the on-field play, I mean, obviously, I think the injury hurts. He was dealing with it pretty much all season, and I mean, he finally got healthy, then got hurt again a little bit, and just sort of snowballed from there. But at the end of the day, like there can't be many excuses, and I think that's how the Bucs are looking at it. Like you paid a guy, like, and if you're out there, you're good enough to play. If you're healthy enough to play, you go play, and you got to play well. So, just he didn't do that consistently enough. So, we'll see. I think this is one of the tougher decisions that I think they would have to make because. Uh, yeah, when you're $55 million over the cap, like you got to make tough decisions, but it's only saving a minimal amount. It's not like when we talked about Donovan Smith, you're saving almost $10 million. You're only saving about 2.8, close to $3 million here, and you're also creating a hole. in your third wide receiver spot, that would mean that the current Buccaneer wide receivers under contract, if they were to, let's say, release Russell Gage, let's say that, it would be Chris Godwin, Mike Evans, Julio Jones is a free agent. Scotty Miller is a free agent. Rashad Perryman is a free agent. So you would essentially have Devin Tompkins there, and yeah, not fun. Kalen Geiger's in the mix. That's what you're looking at if you would release Russell Gage. So you would definitely have to replace a guy like Gage because I don't think they want to be going into the season with Devin Tompkins as their third wide receiver. So um, it would be a tough decision, but I could see them making it because of the cap situation and because clearly just like Reynolds is sort of saying there's frustration there over how he handled his rehab. Now how he exactly handled it, we don't know, but clearly it was something that the team and him weren't on the same page of.
And Reynolds does talk about that here at the end paragraph, right, where he says, as you said, Julio Jones, Scotty Miller, Brashad Perriman, they're all free agents and unlikely to return, according to Reynolds. It is a safe bet that the Bucs will draft a wide receiver or two this year to restock at the position, especially if Gage is released. But like you said, the reason that I think this makes it such a difficult move, in my opinion, is because you are creating such a significant hole. Right now, as it stands, look, you have Evans, you have Godwin, and you have Gage. If you get rid of Gage at that point, you have a void essentially at your wide receiver depth after Evans and Godwin. And that's not a knock on guys like Devin Tompkins or Kalen Geiger necessarily. I mean, could they be good depth? I guess, but they're extremely unproven and a huge, huge question mark. You've got to get more guys in there, even if you keep Gage on your team, let alone if you get rid of him. That's what makes me believe more so, Evan, that they may lean more on the side of keeping Gage. You're going to have a new offensive coordinator. Bowles knows this is a pretty critical year in terms of needing success, especially on the offensive side. So maybe you want to try to retain as many options that you have in terms of offensive weapons. And I know people will say, oh, but getting rid of Donovan Smith and getting rid of Leonard Fournette, what are you talking about? But those moves are going to save more cap space. Right now, in terms of, I would say, pretty much all of the salary cap cuts that they could make, Evan, Gage saves them the least amount of money, correct?
Yeah, and when you talk about Fournette, the difference there, and that's what we talked about Donovan Smith as well, is why cutting Donovan Smith would be a tough decision. Fournette, you already have basically a plan in place for after Fournette. That because you have Rashad White there. So behind Gage, you don't have much. Behind Donovan Smith, you don't have much. So those two are really, really difficult. We talked about Cameron Brate, and so I actually think Brate might save them less than Gage. But I mean, Bright, at this point, like, what is he, So that makes sense. But I still think Gage can be a productive player. That's the issue. He's still young enough. And I do think, actually, I agree with your point. I think they're going to lean towards keeping him.
And even to the point of Brate, you have Kate Otten, you have Ko
Yes.
Keith, you have guys there. This is one of those situations where it is like a Donovan Smith situation, which I know a lot of people were very hectic about that, our takes on that situation, but it is a similar situation. Okay, you can get rid of the guy, but who's next? Who are
Mm-hmm.
you going to bring in to replace Russell Gage? You don't have a lot of money to work with, and in such a crucial season for Todd Bowles, for Dave Canales, for whoever's going to be in there at quarterback, do you want to run that risk of bringing in two rookie wide receivers and maybe a middling veteran to go along with some undrafted free agents? I just don't necessarily know if the Buccaneers are going to make that risk, which is why, again, I say I think they're going to lean more towards keeping Russell Gage just to have more continuity at their wide receiver room, have more depth at their wide receiver room. And like you said, Gage is still a young guy and he can still contribute. He's got 2 years left on his deal. Why not see what the guy can do with an offensive coordinator who has worked a lot of good things with wide receivers in the past? I think that is where the Buccaneers should go in terms of this route. But again, like you said, with them being so far over the salary cap, with them needing to make some tough decisions, maybe they do decide to move on from Gage, although I personally would not, Evan. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, the tough thing is when you're doing that, like they're already going to have so many needs this offseason. And right now, wide receiver isn't at the top of that. But if you were to do that, if you were to release Gage, then wide receiver sort of becomes a need. So, do you really want, is the cap savings of $2.8 million, is it really worth having to go out and use a draft pick on a guy or sign another guy in free agency who may or may not be better than Russell Gage? So, it's a tough decision. And that's why I just think maybe next year, if he disappoints again, maybe. But I just think for this year, I think it's in their best interest to hope that he bounces back. And I think ultimately they will decide to do that.
Well, folks, let us know your thoughts and opinions about this Russell Gage situation down in the comments section below. We would love to hear it. Go check out my colleague Evan Wanish's work over at BucsNation.com. Also, go check out the latest episode of the Cannon Fire podcast because they finally uploaded. And also, go check out the Real to Real podcast as well, which I am on as well. So, Evan, thank you so much for being on this video. It is greatly, greatly appreciated. Folks, thank you all so much for watching this video. Hope y'all enjoyed, and we will see you all in the next video or the next live stream. But until then, and as always, guys, goodbye for now, and go Bucs.